The conversation today will last between 30 and 40 minutes, and there will be about 10 to 15 minutes for additional questions at the end. So with that being said, let's turn to our featured guests and the authors of White Jesus. Got my copy here. The Architecture of Racism in Religion and Education. And first, I just want to say a bit about the book from its introduction. White Jesus was constructed by combining empire, colorism, racism, education, and religion. The byproduct is a distortion that reproduces violence in epistemic and physical ways. The authors distinguish White Jesus from Jesus of the Gospels, the one whose life, death, and resurrection demands sacrificial love as a response, a love ethic. White Jesus is a fraudulent scheme that many devotees of Jesus of Bethlehem naively fell for, and this book is about naming the lies, reclaiming the person of Jesus, and reasserting a vision of power that locates Jesus of the Gospels in solidarity with the easily disposed. So, with that, I want to begin by asking each of you for authors the inevitable why question. Why write White Jesus? And perhaps not only why did you choose to be involved with this project, but why did you choose to be involved now at this time? Alex, since it's your name first here on the cover of the book, let's start with you.
Yeah. Lacey, thank you so much for inviting us to this talk, and we're really excited to be able to share and launch this book that just came out. This actually is the second book. The first book was White Out, and we're talking about the white architecture of the mind, and the primary focus on that book that Christopher Collins and I wrote was looking at the structures of whiteness and white dominance in colleges and universities in America. And the critique that we got initially, and when you go and talk at different places, the critique we get most from Christians is, well, this applies to a secular group, but this isn't true in the church. People would have this sort of colorblind ideology, colorblind theology to say that, you know, God loves everyone the same and doesn't recognize the different races. I don't think that's true. Man did not create diversity, God did. And so for us to take that colorblind theological approach is problematic, especially then that leads to inaction, or worse, a justification for some of the social ills and racial injustices that we see. So we felt compelled to want to write about what the challenges are in the church that addresses a racial inequity and dominance and superiority. And it goes unrecognized. It's so deep. The equation has always been American equals Christian equals white equals Republican. And it's a seamless kind of understanding, that architecture of the mind, so much so that when you're critiquing some of the challenges of racial injustice in America, Christians get upset. White Christians will get upset because they're unable to separate and see the distinctions. And oftentimes what happens is you hear this criticism that people who engage in racial justice work, equity scholars who are Christians, are accused of all sorts of things. You know, they're cultural Marxists and all that. What would be the alternative of that? Well, it would be white supremacy, that it's so deeply ingrained that it impacts some of our theology and our everyday Christian practices. And so part of the challenge for this book and what we really wanted to accomplish was to name it, to state it, and to have something that leads to conversation for us to say, do you recognize this? Do you see these, the distinctions that we're trying to make that have heretofore gone unnoticed or unchallenged? And so that was the ultimate goal for this book. Part of the challenge also was with the election of our 45th president and all this news about the 81% white evangelicals who voted for the president, with clearly stated, documented statements and ideologies that really spoke to some racism and white supremacist notions. And despite that, elected by a majority of white evangelicals, and conversations that we've been having with, I would say, my brothers and sisters in the faith who share the same God, yet have a very different understanding of white supremacy. And so that was part of the challenge too, to address some of these concerns, the whiteness that is embedded in a lot of our theology and our everyday Christian practices. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues weigh in as well.
Thank you, Alex. And Tabatha, how about for you?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Alex. And as I joined this book project, one of the first things I thought about was my growing up in Texas here in the United States as a Black Catholic initially, and also in connection with a very small tradition of Black Churches of Christ. As I think about this conversation and why I joined the book, I wanted to center my own positionality as a Black woman and a Christian in the discussion. I also joined the conversation mindful of my ancestors, particularly my enslaved ancestors who have struggled to make my presence in this reality today even possible. Their struggle against oppression and apartheid in the United States is something that motivates my participation. And on today, I'm especially thinking about James Cone, the father of Black theology, and Katie Geneva Cannon, one of the mothers of womanist theology here in the United States in particular, and the ways in which they have formed my thinking about this particular passage in Scripture. And that is from Acts 10, verse 39. They put him to death by hanging him on a cross, by hanging him on a tree. When I think about that image, and I think about Mother Emanuel, June 17th, 2015, when worshipers, 9 of them, all Black, invited in a white man to join their Bible study and welcomed him. And survivors have said that when they began to discuss and actually disagree about Scripture, his disagreement, in fact, in an act of white supremacist violence, 9 people were murdered by a white male supremacist. Their names are Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee, DePayne, Middleton Doctor, Clementa Pinckney, Tawanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, and Myra Thompson. And even now, on the 24th of October, a white man, after spending some time trying to get into a predominantly Black church, went to a local grocery store, Kroger's, and murdered Maurice Stollard and Vicki Jones at Kroger's while his 12-year-old grandson looked upon them. They had been shopping for poster paper for a school project. And I'm also reeling, like my colleagues, from what happened on October 27th, a Saturday morning during Shabbat service at the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, a synagogue where worshipers had gathered to practice their faith. A white gunman ran into the synagogue and shouted anti-Semitic slurs, wounding 6 and murdering 11 congregants whose names are Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, his brother, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger. You know, and I think about why now, I think about what Reverend Dr. Barber said when recounting what Martin Luther King had to say when 4 little girls were murdered in an Alabama church. He said that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, while that is certainly important, but about the system and the way of life and the philosophy that produced the murderer. So when I joined this conversation in this book project, which is life-giving and sobering, I do so in the spirit of a formerly enslaved African, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was an anti-lynching activist. And she said, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. So that's what this book project is about for me as a Black woman, as a Christian, and as an educator, because I believe it is my sacred duty to disrupt the kind of mythology, the mythology of white Jesus in my own personal life and in the religious and educational institutions to which I belong.
Thank you, Tabatha. Allison, same question for you, the why and also the why now.
Yeah, thank you, Lacey, and thank you, Alex and Tabatha, for those introductions as well. And I would say, you know, it's been such a privilege for me personally to be a part of this book. When I started this project, these people who I have written the book with were my professors. And now at least they tell me that I'm their colleague. And that's quite a change that has taken place in my life since I started this book. So it really is my privilege to kind of be able to tag along with these scholars and learn from them and be a part of this project. Racial diversity has been a complex issue in my life. Racial justice has been something that's been important to me since I was a girl. But I've really had the privilege of being, can you still see me, Lacey? Something just happened to my
computer. I can't see you. Yeah. So, Robert, I see you. I think you might be trying to share your screen. If you don't mind not sharing your screen, we'd appreciate it so that we can keep the video on the speakers.
Do you want me just to keep going?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I've had the privilege of being able to be curious about race rather than being confronted by race and racism. And that is because I have grown up obviously as a white woman, and that has given me that privilege. But in my family, I've had a complex racial diversity in my family that has raised a lot of questions for me throughout my childhood and throughout my life. And I do share with some of my colleagues of color and friends and family of color and saying that I have ancestors who experienced horrific racism. So I have some of those kinds of historical wounds, I think, in my blood, but I also have the complexity and the privilege of walking around in a body that's white and that has privilege that was not ever realized by many of my ancestors. So that has created really throughout my life this curiosity to understand that better, which kind of came to fruition when Dr. Alex Jun became my dissertation chair at APU. And my dissertation focused highly on white administrators who were active in racial justice advocacy. And then through that process of the dissertation, started writing and reading about the white church and the history of whiteness and racism within the white church. I will just say one thing about that really I feel like helped me to contribute to this book, and that a lot of my dissertation was a part of this book. But that is really what I learned probably the most from that process that I think contributes to this book is that the white Christian church has had a history of interpreting biblical passages to maintain white dominance. And that has been something that has happened throughout the history of the white church, and I would believe is still happening today. I think that's the part that I've contributed probably the most to the book in my own research in that area. But I think that it's critical that we examine that, we understand that, and we dismantle that, and that we understand what it means to interpret the Bible in the way that Jesus would as he lived, in the way that we are as Christians as well. And I'll just close by saying Mark Laberton of Fuller Seminary one time said, he said, the problem of evil, the great question has always been, if God is so good, why does he allow evil in the world? But he said that his problem of evil is this: if God is all powerful and all good, why has the white church been so unchanged? And that to me is the biggest question that I have right now in my own spiritual life and my own pursuit of racial justice. And I have wanted this book to be a part of that, of changing the church and changing the way that we understand racial justice.
Thank you so much, Allison. Chris, how about you? To wrap us up here, what is your why for writing White Jesus, and why now at this time?
Yeah, Alex addressed the pragmatic, reason as to why it was designed as a follow-up book to Whiteout, to address religious and spiritual dimensions. But just because you have an initial why doesn't mean that that's what sustains you or maintains your involvement. I'll take a little different approach to answer the question and say I became very uncomfortable during the writing of the book. I actually became completely afraid that this was irreverent and that we were doing something that was out of bounds, or maybe even forsaking, what we might believe individually in some ways. And then what became crystal clear was how dangerous this aberration is, and that it moved from being uncomfortable with writing it to being uncomfortable with not writing it, being uncomfortable with not talking about it, being uncomfortable with letting connections go between the way in which we learn things in Bible class and in universities and other places, and not connecting them to the social and behavioral and systemic outcomes that we see in society. And so the connections that we see, we reach for them and point out the areas in which, you know, we see danger. If you have a theology, a human designed kind of thinking about God, a claim that this is how we know God, and you don't excavate and interrogate that for the ways in which it reproduces our own supremacy, then we position ourselves as God. And that's how we ended up with White Jesus.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to each of you for sharing a little bit more about what led you to write and to be a part of this project. We're going to transition now into more of a conversation amongst us about questions that we've received in advance and that pertain to the content and also the process of writing, and then, of course, the context that sort of surrounds this book. Participants, just a reminder to you, if you've only just joined us, to please type your questions in the chat box. You can send it to me privately, or I believe there's a Zoom group chat as well, and we can keep the conversation going. We have some time set aside here for questions that come up as this conversation progresses. So please do share, and I'll be checking there throughout our conversation. So our first question was submitted by multiple participants, and it concerns the co-authorship of this book. It's not every day that someone finds a book like this by 4 different authors with distinct lived experiences and points of view. And so the question is sort of 2-part. Where did the idea for White Jesus originate, or with whom? And did it start with just one author, or was it multiple people? And maybe then to add on to that, what was it like to write a book with 3 other perspectives? So having 4 on this project, what was that like?
Well, let me begin by saying we realize how critical it is to be inclusive, and you see the benefits. Perhaps listeners here have realized the 4 perspectives that are brought just in writing this book gives you a much fuller, deeper, richer experience of who the authors are and what we're bringing. And I think that's ultimately, what we all appreciate is the different life experiences that we bring. There's diversity, obviously, in ethnic makeup, in gender, but also our faith traditions. And I think that's an important element that we talk about in the book, and how we all theologically will disagree. Also, we don't align on every single issue theologically. We've had some good conversations amongst the authors on theology. But clearly, one of the things that we would all agree on is this idea of empire and power, dominance. And so that was important for us to write, and to hear it from multiple perspectives. I think that would be important. It's something that I'm trying to practice more in my own life in terms of understanding and embracing diverse perspectives on any given topic. And so that's what you'll get in the book, is you'll have the various opinions. And I think I love the complexity of that. I love that we're not uniform in our thinking as we approach this, theologically, ethnically, or in terms of gender. And so I think that's really helpful. And yet at the same time, we're able to address an issue that we all agree has been a problem that has gone on without fully addressing it. So that I'll just start with that to say we were intentional about embracing both our theological differences, our gender differences, and our ethnic differences.
Yeah. And I appreciate your geographic, or your kind of location within the U.S. and the differences there in terms of where your story originated and where it brought you. I think there's, many experiences that have been touched on based on the 4 of you writing this that couldn't have come through with just one author. And so that's very evident from the first, foreword, which features each of your 4 stories. And I think that's such a profound way to begin the book. For anyone else, what about co-authorship in the process, and what that's been like for you?
I'll jump in to say it's really been a true privilege to work alongside each of my colleagues. And I think as we sort of are mindful to be what we might call self-reflexive, right? Thinking about this question of white Jesus, which is not a new question, by the way, right? This is something that many scholars have written about and talked about. But we wanted to sort of take that question, which has sort of an arc of conversation surrounding it, and to think about it in relationship to our own bodies and to the relationship that we have with institutions like our churches, like our university context, but also then to invite others in to do the same. And so we recognize that not everyone will approach this book from the vantage point from which we do. In fact, there are many voices in this text that are missing. And so it's really about an invitation for us to be self-reflexive and to participate in a conversation that predates all of us, in fact, but to invite us in a particular moment in time and in the history of this particular United States, and frankly, around the globe, to think about this book and to think about this mythology, right, of white Jesus from the perspective of multiple positionalities. We think about multiple communities who experience oppression, some of which are not included in this book. And so it's meant to be an interrogation, but also an invitation and a window into a conversation that I think we need to have more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this second question is about readership, actually. Who is the intended audience for White Jesus? Is there anyone who wouldn't benefit from reading a book like this? And sort of to tack on maybe a hypothetical, who would you be most surprised to learn is reading White Jesus? Which, by the way, is available on Amazon. I encourage all participants to order your copy. But I just kind of put that forward, a question of readership and intended audience.
I feel like Chris needs to answer this one.
Why do I need to answer that? I mean, this is what publishers ask all the time, like, who are you designing this for? Who's actually going to buy this, overpriced book or whatever? And I don't really know. I mean, I suspect that we have a choir of people that have informed our thinking and our, sort of, in the fabric of the way we see the world that might enjoy it. Beyond that, I have no idea who's actually going to, read this book. It'll be interesting to see if it moves outside of the university kind of atmosphere, published by an academic press, and gets into churches. And Christina Cleveland, in her blurb about the book, which is on the it's available on Amazon, and it's in the first couple pages of the book. She said, I recommend this for all seminary classes, and I will assign this in my seminary classes. And I thought, wow, now that's just something that I never imagined. We're not professors of theology, but what an amazing thing for someone like her to say. So I don't know, but I'm sure we'll find out.
Mm-hmm.
Our intent, though, since we're all in Christian higher education and in higher education in general, and we're all people who are regular churchgoers, part of it for me would also be anyone who is in a position of authority and has a sphere of influence in the church in America, and also by extension, Christian colleges and universities and other ministries to read this. And again, it's an opportunity, it's a thought piece to consider what you haven't considered before. Have we been unable to separate our own culture from our faith practices and our tradition? Do we see a form of this syncretism involved, and it's gone unchallenged and unchecked? And so as we continue to perpetuate what we understand to be American Christianity across the country, and most of the people we hope who will read this are people in positions where they're continuing to move forward with the Church of Jesus Christ, which is wonderful. But have they considered how culture has been embedded in it? So that's part of the hope for us, is that folks in positions of leadership, of course, students and scholars in secular and in Christian institutions, we're hoping would read this. If I can add one more piece, I think this would be helpful for my secular colleagues in my field and in other disciplines who have, rightly so, been very critical of evangelical Christians, of Christians in general, and the way we hold uncritically to a lot of things that happen in the United States, especially with the political climate that we have right now. My hope is, and we're glad we went with a secular, if I could say a secular academic publication house with Peter Lang, which we're grateful for. We want to think about how this message comes across as we talk about our own people, sort of airing our own family laundry, if you will, to say these are challenges that we want to recognize and be lovingly critical of, things that we are aware of in our own backyard. And hopefully in that way, it will be in some form of a message to say that we are not uncritical as Christians, and as scholars especially, that we're aware of some of the challenges.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Alex. Tabatha, were you going to jump in? I don't want to.
I was going to jump in with just one final, very brief comment. You know, as I think ahead to the fact that many of us will be voting on Tuesday, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I think this book would help to be useful to the voting public. And I'd be most surprised, I'm just going to say it on my own behalf, if Donald Trump read this book, but I sure would like him to. I'd like him to reflect on it as the leader of the U.S. empire.
I think he'd find his name in it too. A little shout out to him as well. So I do want to go back and sort of connect to this idea about using white Jesus as an introduction of sorts. And there are a couple questions around how someone might go about introducing a concept like white Jesus to someone, maybe in the family, maybe over the holidays when we anticipate seeing family members. So thinking of a person who might be unfamiliar with a construct like white privilege, for example, or even a cultural, concept like cultural bias. The question is sort of how do you sort of introduce white Jesus and this premise of the book?
Yeah, I would just say to buy a copy and have them read it. I think that's probably the best thing to do. It's kind of all right there in black and white. But I think, but not everybody's going to do that, or buy it for them and give it to them as a gift, an early Christmas gift at Thanksgiving. And also buy the Whiteout book for them to read that one as well. But I would just say, I think some of the most challenging times to talk about these kinds of things are within our own family systems. I was talking to a friend earlier today, actually, and talking about what it's like to love people or someone so deeply and disagree almost as deeply as your love, but your love just goes a little bit deeper than the disagreement. And I think that when it comes to introducing concepts like these to people, love really does have to be supreme over the difference. But that unfortunately sometimes has been understood to say that love always has to be kind, nice, and polite. And while, of course, those are good qualities to have, I think it's also okay sometimes to say things that people aren't going to like and are going to make people feel perhaps uncomfortable. So I would say, as a person who has really tried to talk about these things, not only in my family, but with my friends and other people, I would say that that these concepts that we have in the book are really about history. Many of them are about factual laws, about things that you can actually look up and read historically that happened. Some of them are opinions and thoughts and philosophies, but not everything. I think that sometimes people think that conversations about race are identity politics and only subjective opinions. But if you read the book and if you read history, we'll see that whiteness was a constructed apparatus to maintain and create power. And that is really, in my opinion, a historical fact that is laid out not only obviously in this book and Whiteout, but in a lot of other places as well. So I think being able to, for those of us who have people that we love deeply, understand that really helping people to understand these concepts is an act of love and care, grace to them and to the people that they love and know as well.
Thank you, Allison. Any other thoughts on that, sort of introducing the concept of white Jesus?
I think it's important for us to recognize any resistance from people we love, colleagues, neighbors, and friends. It's the degree to which you are resistant that I'm probably most concerned. Why is it that we can't hold on to this idea, even in disagreement, to at least hear it out and consider what has been written? So we've taken great time and effort to make sure that the way that the book is written, the way it's delivered, the message delivered is, I would say, winsome and charitable and fair. Not a rant, not necessarily any sort of personal attack or ad hominem. That's what our goal was, and hopefully we've achieved it. That's what we tried to maintain. But even in that, to be able to disagree and find ways to disagree in a way that at least we're taking, as Allison said, historical context and understanding what has been written in the laws and passed down, and how did that come about? The white architecture of the mind is, Chris, maybe you'll speak to this. The architecture of the mind requires an architect. Someone had to design this, and the mindset was already in place before the architecture or the structure or the system was enacted. And so that's something for us to consider as well.
Thank you. There are a few questions about process. Tabatha, in your intro, you spoke of some names of people whose work and whose scholarship has influenced your writing. And so sort of on that thread, who are the theologians, historians, teachers, scholars, artists who are speaking into your writing, specifically of white Jesus? And were there any texts that you return to again and again as a resource for you as you wrote?
Yeah, so I'll start, and I think other colleagues will chime in. For me, I mentioned the names of James Cone and Katie Geneva Cannon, as well as, I'll add now, Jacqueline Grant, who are all Black theologians who bring a sort of critique to this conversation about white Jesus. And so if I had the opportunity to ask them, two of which are deceased, if they had ever met white Jesus before, I'd be assured that they had. So in other words, asking Black folks about white Jesus it sort of is an assumption that you've met him already. I don't have to introduce you. It's for white folks often that we have to introduce white Jesus, because when you ask Indigenous folks and Black folks and others who've been minoritized and dispossessed in this particular country, which is not only a historical reality, but a present day reality, we know who white Jesus is. And it is often our labor, frankly, that introduces and reintroduces white Jesus to our white brothers and sisters and colleagues. So it's been important for me to think about, again, the voices and perspectives of, in particular, theologians, and in particular, Black theologians, who bring a certain relationship to this conversation about white Jesus, not just as an icon or an image, but again, a mythology that organizes and structures the way people create life and institutions.
Thank you.
What would other folks say on the call in terms of our folks that we consulted?
Yeah, I'll go with Sean Michael Lucas, who is in my denomination, Presbyterian Church in America. We are both theologically and probably socially conservative, generally speaking, but his work on the continuing church, really, really helpful for me, and very pleasantly surprised that a white Presbyterian would write such a book on talking about race and speaking truth about our own denomination, which is really, really helpful. Important read for me as I think of sort of modern day theologians and pastors. That was an important work for me as I thought about this book.
Thanks. Any others?
You know, I would say some of the early seeds in my life were James Cone. You know, when I started reading him, and I said, you know, when I read him, he sounds angry, and I want to know more about that. and I want to understand where that is and what that means as a white person for me. So he was really instrumental in my life at the beginning. And then, as you'll see in the book, we do quote him in the book as well. And I just want to say the professors and theologians, I would actually list the three that are here right now, Dr. Tabatha Jones Jolivet and Chris Collins and Alex John, in my own personal life, and have really impacted my writing, and they'll be the people that I talk about when I'm on another webinar someday. But then Dr. Love Seacrest at Fuller Seminary, she's a New Testament scholar. Her work is really has influenced me greatly. Dr. Reggie Williams is an ethicist, also as well wrote the book Black Jesus. And it was a huge influence in my life. But I would say probably the biggest one for me right now is Willie Jennings, and just the work that he's doing, and the way that his mind is just so incredible. His mind reminds me of the Grand Canyon, how it's just so deep and complex with so many layers, and he's able to articulate that and get that in writing that in ways I've just probably never seen before. And I really appreciate him, and that has been, I think, seen some of those theologians have been seen in this book and in our writing.
Great.
And I'll just quickly add that when I first read James Cone, Black Liberation Theology and God of the Oppressed, I felt like my personal faith came alive in a way that it had never before. When I read James Cone, he didn't sound angry to me. It sounded like Jesus was coming alive, like embodied. And I think just not in terms of an academic study or for the purpose of writing a book, reading the work of James Cone just transformed my faith. On top of that, Richard Hughes has written a lot, and both personally and as a writer, he's very influential in my own thinking.
Thank you all. I think just for our sort of structured discussion time, I've got one more question, and I think this question could be a webinar in itself. So part 2, I'm just putting it on the table. But I do want to ask a question specifically in regards to the church. One participant wrote in to say they've often witnessed the equation of Christ likeness with white likeness in church settings and in Christian higher education. And so I'll pose to you something that this participant wrote, but also other questions were submitted along these lines as well. How can those in positions of privilege gain the necessary awareness of the ways in which their biases are impacting those whom they lead? And White Jesus, I think, is an answer, reading this book, in many ways. And Alex, you had mentioned that you picture an intended audience being someone in a position of authority for this book. But is there any other kind of way forward or step forward for someone who is in a position like that within the church or in Christian higher ed, and they're looking to expand their awareness?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, as an educator, I really believe that the lens by which we've been using to gaze upon the other has not been a window at all. It's been a mirror. And our ability to reflect upon our own identity and who we are, I think, is important. And so can't stress enough the importance of anyone in a position of leadership to be a reader. And read as much as you can and challenge yourself and get uncomfortable and do some more excavation on your own identity and how you understand things that you have never challenged yourself on. And in many cases, I think of my white brothers and sisters in the church, their own identity, ethnic identity, has gone unchallenged. It's the idea of normativity, to say, well, there's ethnic groups and ethnic food, but mine's just normal, mine's regular, mine's human. And then you equate that with Christianity, and you've not been able to make the distinction, so that, Christ-like is white-like makes a lot of sense because it's gone unchallenged. We've got a chapter in the book on missions and boarding schools and adoption, and I'm very involved with foreign missions through my denomination. I love the work of missionaries, and I think it's very important. So I'll put it out there that it's something that I love, and it's a ministry that I care deeply about. But at the same time, recognizing that there are flaws because we are unable to recognize who it is that we're proclaiming. Is it a democratic, capitalist, white Jesus from America that we're trying to share and proclaim, especially when we go to other countries. So what is it that we're really focusing on? And people who are proclaiming Christ in other countries as missionaries, if they haven't done a fair job, of course you're going to do ethnography and study the culture, study the other, but we also have to study ourselves. And one of the chapters, we're really hoping that this would spark some good conversation to think, have I challenged myself in the way that I present music and worship? White worship is another chapter that we talk about, to say, in what ways has my understanding of worship been really influenced by my culture and traditional practices that have gone unchecked? So, lots of examples like that, but that's what we're trying to stress. Chris could probably talk a little bit more about the section that we talk about in adoption. But again, it doesn't have to be in formal positions of authority, but even in our own home, when we talk about transracial adoption, how aware are we in terms of our awareness and identity, ethnic identity, and how the interplay of that affects everyone around us?
Wow, thanks, Alex. Chris, did you want to speak to that at all, the chapter that Alex is referencing?
Well, I'll put a hook out there for it. It was the hardest chapter for me to write because it's personal. It's about my family. And some of the stories I allude to in there are not even my stories to tell. They're my children's stories to tell. And it was hard, and I had to carefully vet those thoughts about the role of white families adopting children that are not white. And it's very, very complicated. And it should not be treated as anything other than complicated, because there's not just a simple linear, we need to do good, and this is a way to do good, and that's the end of it. Anything that perpetuates color blindness within that scenario can do violence and do harm. So I'll say that particular chapter, or at least that section, was the hardest section to write for me. Maybe one of the most important, though, for me also to write in the book, in working out my own thoughts. But, it's so carefully worded that I'm actually not going to speak on it any more than that, and just say, when you get to that section in that chapter, you'll see.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So that sort of wraps up our structured conversation about some questions we've received in advance. And we have gotten a couple questions here through the chat. One of them is just sort of simply about how many ways we can access this book. Will it be available on audio? Will the four of you get around the table and do a reading? Is there an electronic version out there that somebody could pull up on their Kindle? Any waves or word about that?
I think that there will be a Kindle version. In the book contract that we signed with Peter Lang, it outlines a provision for a Kindle version, but I think you can get an electronic version on the Peter Lang website now. So if you just wanted to access it online, you can do that through Peter Lang's site online. In terms of an audiobook, I'd never even thought about it, but I know that there are ways to get it done, so we'll have to look into it.
I don't know too many academic books that are audio, but that's...
Hey, this could be the first one.
Oh, yes. Yes. This book, yeah, it traverses so much terrain. I think there's definitely interest out there for it to be an audiobook, if you'd be so willing.
It's not our place to, but since I'm Asian, I'm going to say, always start with an apology and say, I'm sorry the book is so expensive. I mean, goodness gracious. For an academic book, it's not. It's actually quite cheap, but given the topic and the types of folks who want to read it, I know that it is a little more pricey than you would get for, a non-academic publishing house.
But can I just say, and I know we were talking about this earlier, Alex, but as I read, I realize it looks, like, maybe this is, no, like I'm five pages, like, wow, I got to sit with this. I got to let this soak in. I got to think about how this changes so much subtext. It's bringing things to light and putting meaning onto things that I haven't looked at so closely. And that's been my experience. So, $1 per thought, it's priceless. How's that? Okay, so transitioning a little bit into another question that we've received via chat. Someone is referencing a little bit more about the deconstruction process. Someone who's seems like actively deconstructing white Jesus, but is still in white spaces. And they're wondering, what are helpful ways to start this journey while in these spaces?
I can speak a little bit of that, referencing a little bit of my journey. I referenced earlier the first theologian that really impacted me was James Cone, and I mentioned that idea of how he sounded to me. And I think what the reason that I heard James Cone the way I did was because of my own sense of fragility and my own sense of even reading the word white person. I had not heard that a lot in my life. What does it mean that I have a race? What does it mean that I am not a part of the norm, but I am a part of a racial category that has a meaning and a history and an influence in society that needs to be examined? Those are all things that I think, for me as a white person, I think I can probably speak for other white people as well, that can be quite uncomfortable, because part of the privilege has been that we haven't had to interrogate our own spaces and our own selves throughout history, and at least in this country and many places in the world. So I think the deconstruction process, I think for me, had to begin with understanding that I am going to be uncomfortable, and I'm going to enter into a space of discomfort that most likely doesn't compare to the discomfort that other people have felt and historically felt in these conversations. But I have to be willing to set aside the privilege of comfort all the time to be able to enter into these conversations. And so for me, for example, by the time I got done reading James Cone, and now when I read him, there's probably few people I like to read more, because what I used to interpret as being angry or upset, I interpret as being prophetic and true. And that has only been able to happen through the deconstructions process. So I would say for me too, and I would say this to anybody, learn history, just learn facts, learn reality, learn the stuff that we talked earlier about laws and policies. Read theology books from white theologians who have historically said things like, the white race should remain superior. These are words in black and white that have been written in books that were the foundation of our institutions. So I think when we understand that that's the reality that we're living in, we can start to say, okay, what does it mean that I have to start deconstructing myself in a process that's going to feel uncomfortable and reveal some of my fragility in that?
Thank you, Allison.
And Lacey, I would add and join you and Allison in this discussion by saying that there's a recognition that each of us enters this conversation differently. And so when we think about this call, which probably has 50 different people on it, right? The positionalities that we occupy because of the bodies that we live in and the communities to which we belong shape how we start this conversation. And while I identify as a Black woman, I also identify as a U.S. citizen, a form of privilege that I'm very aware of. And so how I interrogate that privilege, right, can't simply be an academic exercise. Bryan Stevenson, who's written a beautiful book, Just Mercy, and who is really a public intellectual and public theologian, has written about what it has meant for him and his experience to not just read about incarcerated peoples who are on death row, but to be in proximity to them, and how that has altered the way he thinks about his responsibility as a person who is not incarcerated. I use that model to think about my own privilege and to think about those with whom I'm willing to be in close proximity. So I think it also starts with who you bring around your family, where you go to eat, right? Who you consider to be your neighbor, which is a question that Jesus of Nazareth himself asked, right? Interrogating and questioning and placing yourself in positions to which you're not simply in the space with someone who is otherized, but you are cultivating kinship with someone who in fact will change you. And it should not be their labor, in fact, to change you. So proximity requires of you a kind of labor that recognizes that you're not engaging in sort of voyeurism or constructing a spectacle out of the relationship, but instead seeking to own up to the ways in which your ego and your privilege dehumanizes. And in that relationship, by allowing yourself to die, something new forms. But I feel like it cannot form without relationship. And that relationship, I think, is not purely an academic relationship. I think that it must be a human-to-human relationship. That's why I love Maya Angelou, who often quoted Terence, who had been enslaved many, many moons ago in ancient Greece. He said, "I am human. Nothing human is alien to me." So when we begin to see the humanity in others and foster a kind of kinship like Father Boyle talks about, where we see others as peers, that has a way of decolonizing what might be at work within us that needs to die. And people of color have to do this work, by the way, too. I don't want for anyone on this call to think that this is just the work of white folks. I think white folks have a special duty, right? But I think this is also true for those of us in communities of color with other multiple identities, right? We also, as much as we engage in and are subjugated through oppressive systems, we also benefit from multiple privileges. And so when we are in close proximity and also engaged in an ongoing process of dying and interrogating, I think that also, along with what Allison has mentioned, helps us to really engage our privilege and the multiple privileges that we often carry.
Tab, that's so good. Let me build on that. Just a real quick thought for people of color, Christians of color, who will engage in this deconstruction. And I'm thinking of Cornel West, who had once said, he's an educated Black academic man in America, and he is daily trying to kill the white supremacist that lives in him. And if that's true for him, how true can that be for me as well? And, other white people, but it's the internalized oppression that we've bought into, the assimilationist model that we've embraced, the self-hate, the dying to the ethnic self and denying the imago Dei, the way the Lord has made us, right, in his image, in order to seek what we thought as people of color, as Christians of color, thought this is the Christian approach, which means a colorblind disregard of your own ethnicity and identity. And I'm not saying don't overcorrect and only embrace your ethnic identity and forsake the Christian identity. No, it's certainly not that. But how do you hold onto two multiple realities?
Who does that well? I think Alex is Jesus. So I want to also center Jesus in this. What you just said, Alex, was so beautiful. And I think that Jesus embodies that. When we go to the Gospels, you look at those red letters in your Bible if you identify as a Christian. You see Jesus living as a Jewish man, first of all, not even as a Christian. The scriptures haven't even been written insofar as what we often as Christians refer to as the New Testament. Jewish folks recognize, right, that the Hebrew Bible is the text that Jesus is building from, right? And so I think when we look at who Jesus is and what he embodied in his lived experience, being able to be a very particular person on this planet, while at the same time sort of submitting his own body and self to the call of the cross, that's kind of sacrificial. And I think that's what, frankly, discipleship calls us to. And it requires us to be able to hold these complex tensions in ways that are what many scholars describe as paradoxical.
Thank you. Thank you, Tabatha. Thank you, Alex. We are about out of time, which is hard for me to believe. I want to thank Alex, Tabatha, Allison, and Chris for being here today, offering your voices and perspectives, and for your collective work writing White Jesus. I do just want to note, and I don't know if they would say this or not, but they have committed proceeds that would typically go to authors to a scholarship fund for higher ed doctoral students at APU, which I think is just another demonstration of commitment to social justice and diversity. So thank you, each of you. I want to kind of give you a chance to offer any final notes for those who are participating. And I do see questions that are coming in, and it's so thoughtful, and I'm appreciative of them, and also aware that I don't know that the time we have left would give space to the questions that are being asked. And so keep asking, get the book, read. Absolutely, I think many of the things that are being asked here and that were questions sent in advance are addressed in the text of the book. But yes, any final thoughts from you four before we end our time?
I'll just offer a quick final thought on the cover of the book, because I thought there had been a couple questions about the cover. So I'm going to quickly share my screen and just talk for a minute. This is the original cover design that we submitted to the publisher as the idea behind the book. So I just want to quickly share my screen and tell you about how that cover idea came together. So did that come through?
Yes.
So
wow.
what you see here is what we gave to the publisher, and this is the traditional Sacred Heart Jesus that you see everywhere. This was on fans in hot churches that had no air conditioning that I grew up in, and on the walls of churches. I mean, this white Jesus is everywhere. And then what you see on the right is a completion of that image. You can see how the lines match up, except on the right side, this Jesus was drawn by an individual in a journal while the individual was sitting in a jail cell because he had just murdered 9 people in a church, and sat down and from memory sketched the same Jesus that you see on the left side. It's not that he was copying something on the wall in a jail cell. They don't have pictures of Jesus on the wall in prison. It was imprinted on his life, in his hands, in his weapons, on his jacket, in his violence, that he drew this image in his journal and then wrote the words, "I want everybody to recognize the importance of Jesus to white culture." And then he's characterized as a bad apple, as a one-off. But he's not a bad apple. He's not something that's disconnected from the roots. On the left side, you see the roots. On the right side, you see the fruits. You see what bad theology produced. And the point of the book is to connect the dots. And to recognize the loss of life and the epistemic violence that continues by not connecting those dots between those two. So that's where the original cover idea from the book came from. And it sort of morphed into something that was, you know, the publisher was comfortable with producing, but this is the original sketch on the right-hand side.
Wow. I'm letting that sit. It's powerful. Thank you, Chris, for sharing the original image. There's definitely been a lot of questions about the cover and how provocative it is, and also how it so aptly sort of connects root and fruit, as you said. So any other final thoughts before I offer some last details?
Chris, thank you for vocalizing what I know is on our hearts. And I just would implore those of us who have influence positions in universities and in churches to locate this question of roots and fruits within our own work, and to examine and investigate the ways in which we might be complicit, and to repent and to turn away. And for those of us who identify with the cross of Jesus, to submit our work and our struggle to the cross so that new life might emerge. And some things need to die in that process.
My quick thought and prayer is that people who are hesitant and resistant just by the cover and the topic, that we would embrace it and recognize that we wrote this not to be divisive, but that we are already united. You know, it's a brother and sister who are trying to reconcile, not so that they can become brothers and sisters. They are already united in Christ. They are brothers and sisters. That's why we need to have these conversations. This is why we need to reconcile. And I just want to stress that I recognize our unity that's already in place. And this is why we need to engage in these conversations. For a watching world that wants to see how we address issues and how that unfolds, difficult issues. So I hope that you would give this a fair read. And thank you again, Lacey, for inviting us into this webinar. It's been great for us to be able to join together and talk.
Well, absolutely. Thanks to each of you. Comments are coming in just that this webinar in and of itself is revelatory, and I think it's just an honor to have the four of you weighing in with your voices, and of course to have this book available. So we are out of time. I want to thank everyone who was able to join us today. This session is being recorded, and I think we're going to be able to get this posted on the Critical Issues in Higher Education website, which is a link I will provide to all participants after we close here, along with a quick survey for your feedback about the webinar. Your input is invaluable in shaping the future webinars, and we do anticipate being able to offer more of these in the Critical Issues in Higher Education webinar series. If you do want to know more about doctoral programs, someone mentioned intensives and continuing this conversation at intensives here at APU, either our EDD or PhD program, go online, apu.edu/graduate/doctoral, and you can find out more about us and the work that we do here. Have a wonderful day, each of you. May you go still considering, still thinking, asking questions, and open to new levels of awareness. Thanks again to our guests, our featured guests, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.